All right, well, welcome everyone and good morning to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. And we're glad you could join us for today's session. We'll be covering what's bugging your corn this year. So we'll be talking about insect pests in corn. And these sessions are brought to you by University of Minnesota Extension and generous support from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, as well as the Corn Growers Research and Promotion Council. I'm Dr. Anthony Hansen, an IPM extension educator based out of Morris at the West Central Research and Outreach Center. And we welcome two speakers today. One is Dr. Ken Ostlie. He's professor of entomology and extension entomologist based out of the Department of Entomology at the U of M. We also have Bruce Potter, IPM specialist based out of Lamberton in southwestern Minnesota. And just for a few housekeeping details, these sessions are meant to be more of a discussion type format. We'll have about 10 minutes of information presented, starting with Ken Ostlie, and then we'll have more of a panelist discussion where we'll open things up and have questions answered that you might have. And this will focus on questions either we received at registration, or if you have questions that currently come up during this time, you can click that Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. You can enter any questions you have. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you can hover your mouse near the bottom of that screen and that toolbar should appear. And there's also a chat box. If you have technical issues, you can use that option, but we'll try to stick to the Q&A box for questions about content itself. And at the very end, we'll have a very short 3-question survey when you leave the session. And just take a minute or two to provide a little feedback in today's session. That helps us out for evaluation of these programs. And each of these sessions are being recorded and will be posted at a later date on the website. And with that, I can turn it over to Dr. Ken Ostlie to talk a little about corn rootworm especially.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'll be sharing a screen with you shortly here. All right, so the focus today is on what's bugging us in terms of corn insects. It seems pleasantly distant ago that we were seeing scenes like this with more cold, brutal weather, and it probably has you thinking of the excitement of seeing spring come, wondering what the cold did with insects. And so Bruce and I are going to share some different dimensions of that as we go through the next few minutes here. When we're thinking about prospective insect problems, it's important to keep in mind that we have 5 categories of insects out there that are pests. We have locals. These are primarily pests that are residing here. They overwinter here. And in general, they're fairly well adapted to the situation that we have in Minnesota. And in general, brief periods of cold weather like we had this year are not a big challenge to them. What we're going to see next summer potentially is just carryover from 2020 and what that ramifications that has as modified by weather in our cropping situation. We have opportunists that are weather related. Think of insects that are more problematic during drought. We have migrants, and these can't overwinter here. They come from more southern locales, and because of the way the jet stream sets up, et cetera, and the long distance transport involved with these insects, we very seldomly know exactly what we're going to be getting. And so every year is kind of a surprise that way. Then we have adapters, and these are changing to practices. For example, reduced tillage, increased use of cover crops, for example, are changing the insect community that does best under those conditions. And then finally, we have invasive insects, whether we're talking brown marmorated stink bugs or Japanese beetles or soybean midge. So, you know, there's lots of change every year, and that's one of the things that is very interesting working in Minnesota on corn insects, and I'd have to say that I haven't been bored in the 35 years that I've been working here. As we think about where the insects attacking corn, they come with a variety of targets that the insects are focused on. In general, the last few years, we've had very little in terms of stand reducers. The neonicotinoid seed treatments are doing a fairly good job on most of these in corn. We also have our key pests, the ones that we historically have considered managing in most years, and that's European corn borer and corn rootworms. But of course, we know for the last 20 plus years, European corn borer has not been a significant issue. The last 4 or 5 years, up until 2020, corn rootworm populations had diminished. Thinking about all these insects in terms of the 5 categories, we've got the migrants here are things like armyworm, fall armyworm, the cutworms, corn earworm, and we have new invasives such as brown marmorated stink bug, the Japanese beetle, for example. We have opportunists, and some of those that we have dealt with in drought years include grasshoppers and spider mites. So there's a variety of things that can be affecting the crop this year. I'm going to focus a little bit on what's our remaining key insect pest, which is corn rootworms. Bt resistance continues to develop. Weather management have reduced populations over the last few years. However, conditions were extremely favorable in 2020, and we saw populations build. And if you think of the seasonal play of what's going on with corn rootworms, we're in that winter survival period right now where the eggs are out there in the soil, and we'll see what the outcome of this temperature, cold temperature regime this year will be like. Then in the spring, when those eggs hatch, there's a period where they're very susceptible to conditions, and that is when they're trying to find a root and get established in a root system. At that point, things like spring rainfall, the timing of planting can have big impacts on rootworm populations. Then they go through a larval competition period, and then finally, when the adults come out, you have weather that is eventually potentially affecting egg laying. So think of this, when you think of this cycle, think about what's happened over the last year. In the fall of 2019, we had excellent conditions for egg laying. Adults were able to persist in the field a fairly long time under mild conditions. We had a very mild winter. And then in the spring, in contrast to previous years, we didn't have as many inundative rainfalls. So we had an early planting as well, or more timely planting. And between those two things, colonization was very successful. And as a result, we saw a dramatic increase in adult populations and good egg laying conditions last fall. So all that sets the stage for an increase in corn rootworm pressure this year. How well, the big question, of course, is how are the winter conditions going to affect things? It's well known that certain temperatures are very catastrophic to corn rootworm eggs. However, they are laid in the soil and typically covered by some layer of snow, which acts as an insulating blanket. So the environment that eggs are actually experiencing is dramatically different from air temp. And this was, Eric Lawson did this work and reported in his thesis in 1986 from Iowa State University. And basically he found that winter mortality in Western corn rootworm was linearly related to the amount of cold that those eggs experienced below freezing temperatures. And you may wonder, in the past, what's happened, we had a severe impact on corn rootworms in 1976, 1977, and from 2013 to 2014 winters. And you can see there that the soil temperatures are dropping into the negative teens and even some cases approaching negative 20. And in the next year, following this kind of winter, there was this dramatic decrease in Western corn rootworm populations. Basically, though, northern corn rootworms adapted here as opposed to moving up from the southwestern part of the United States. And so they're much more winter hardy than the westerns are. So that sets the stage for what we're seeing this year. And I just grabbed some data from WICORN to illustrate the importance of snow cover. If you look at the brown line or rust line there, you can see that air temperature got down to an average of -15 at one point in February. But if you look at soil temps, you see that they're relatively stable and only dipping a little bit below freezing. And you may wonder how in the world that can occur. And it's because there was a 6 to 12 inch layer of snow during this time period. And of course, we know fields don't necessarily keep the snow that's landed on them as it blows around in western Minnesota, for example. So it all depends on what kind of snow cover is in the field or parts of the field when the temperatures get low. You can see the results of the 2013 to 2014 cold in this data from Wisconsin, where the northern corn rootworm part of the population significantly increased. That's the ratio is the dashed line here. Even though there was a slight decrease in the population. In terms of status in Minnesota, these are partial results from a sticky trap network. And you can see comparing 2020 on the 2019 on the left and 2020 on the right, that the proportion of fields over 4 beetle per plants, the red dots, it went up under the better conditions in 2020. One of the challenges we've got in management, of course, is status of resistance. And what's changed over the last few years has been that northern corn rootworms have now developed resistance to Bt traits, and it's been verified in North Dakota and Minnesota. We're seeing increasing issues with smart stack and chrome under the heavier pressure that developed in 2020. We know that reports of performance issues also increased during that time period. The challenge with rootworms is always getting a handle on what's going on in the field. This is particularly difficult when you've got rental land changing hands, and if you haven't actually been able to get out in fields and take a look at populations. So, we're always encouraging scouting. What's new with traits? We now have Smart Stacks Pro available. That's now been approved in Europe. And so it's potentially available for growers as an option if they've got increasing issues with Smart Stack or Chrome. We know that on the insecticide front, we have some other options. Aztec is a higher concentration granule. If you don't have smart boxes looking at liquid systems, Index and Ampex are two newer options. I think Ampex at this point doesn't have a full label, but it's one of the products that we've been looking at. The challenge, of course, is just managing the crop budget. Fortunately, it looks like prices for this fall are anticipated to increase, and that's going to take some of the burden off. But it's still wise to take a look at what your inputs are, and are you balancing risk versus the cost of essentially insurance to you. Well, that ends my portion of it. I think that Bruce has some things he would like to share.
Thank you, Ken. And Bruce, to lead you off, I know we had one question at registration that might play into a little bit what you'll talk about. One question was, can one predict if or when conventional corn would cease to be a money-saving management decision on a farm? And I think that relates especially to one slide you have on European corn borer.
Let's see if I can share a slide here. All right, so basically the longer you've had a field in corn, the greater the potential for increasing particular insect problems. And one of those would be European corn borer. Ken mentioned corn rootworms. So I guess the only way to know to have a good feeling on how things are progressing is to do some good scouting. In the case of European corn borer, we do a fall survey. Dr. Bill Hutchinson's lab leads this, and it's funded by the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. And you can see that in the upper in the left slide here, on the upper years are before BT was adopted. You can see some pretty high populations. They're cyclical, of course. And in the last 3 years, 2018 through 2020, those populations are lower. These are general observations. They're particular fields that are economic in all these years, but they're definitely, the overall populations are down. On the right, we've got a picture of tunneling, and based on the fall survey, it looks like damage is maybe a little bit down from 2019, but the interesting thing we picked up on the survey this year, Anthony, was that we're finding fields, particularly in west central and southwest Minnesota, where we had tunnels but didn't have any overwintering larvae in them. So I'm not sure if that's because of disease or not, or another factor. So basically, if a lot of guys are starting to go, because of corn rootworm is the big driver, starting to go to a different rotation, and they're where they can, they're throwing a year of soybeans in that corn to knock corn borers back, or corn rootworm back, and it's also knocking corn borers back in those fields as well. The difference between something like a corn rootworm and a European corn borer is the corn borers will move between fields, so it's more of an area problem. And corn rootworms, Ken, I think will agree with this, are very field specific.
All right, thank you, Bruce. I'm going to go with a couple of questions we're getting in chat right now. One is, they're wondering about the geographic range of corn rootworm. Basically, what is that in the state, and are they capable of causing injury in northwest Minnesota? Well,
historically, you had populations getting up as far as the Fargo-Moorhead area, but in general, that was fairly low and infrequent percentage of fields that would have a problem up that high. However, the amount of corn on corn has increased significantly, and with kind of like warmer seasonal temperatures in general, there's certainly the potential for western corn rootworm to increase at higher levels as we go farther north. And I think northern corn rootworms you can regard as kind of local. They're here, they can handle the temperature, soil temperatures. So, are we going to see more problems? I think, from a weather perspective, that could certainly increase. We know we're getting a little more variability in terms of, winter temperatures, but in general, with the milder trends increasing, this could be a more prevalent issue as we go north.
Thanks, Ken. Another question from the chat is, western corn rootworm specifically has been capable of overcoming broadcast insecticides, DT rotation, fairly quickly, they asked. And how likely and quickly will they be able to overcome RNAi?
So our RNAi is kind of unique in the sense that corn rootworms have never seen anything like that. And the particular pathway that they're trying to disrupt in RNAi is fairly specific to corn rootworms, and in fact, mainly the economically threatening corn rootworms. So think of it this way: there are other wild species of diabrotic out there. They have found that they have gotten some colony development of resistance, and that's one of the reasons you see the RNAi added to our most effective blend of individual traits right now, which would be smart stacks. And so they're trying to buffer things and give it as long a product life as it can. But depending on the amount of selection pressure that is exerted, we're going to see potential for resistance to develop, but the odds are not high immediately.
All right, another question is related to no-till popularity is increasing, and there's another question related to cover crops too. So how are pests and control of them changing with these conditions?
Bruce, you want to take a first stab at that one?
Can you repeat that question, Anthony? I missed I want to make sure I've got the first part of it.
Yep, one question was no-till popularity is increasing. And then another question was the increase in interest in cover crops and how are pests and control of them changing, and basically both of those. That's kind of tied together a little bit too sometimes.
Okay. Well, no-till, what no-till does is it leaves more residue on the surface. It's probably keeping those temperatures a little more moderate. It's allowing probably a few more opportunities for insects to overwinter in the field. Cover crops are kind of something that insects in Minnesota aren't very used to. And when we look at particular issues, winter rye covers in corn, we know are attractive to migrating true armyworms. So that's something people really need to be looking for if they're in that situation. They're probably a little more attractive to black cutworms coming in as well, because there's probably some additional weed growth early in the spring that's not taken out with tillage. The other thing that we can see happening with cover crops is, and I'm a little concerned about it in dry years, is that we've got a perennial species out there in these cornfields, and it's giving spider mites an opportunity to winter right in the cornfield on that rye. And you know, if they're able to move to corn before that cover crop is removed, or if the cover crop is left in there too long before it's terminated, they've got an opportunity to move right to corn within the field instead of having to move off the field edges. So I think those are some of the bigger issues with cover crops. In a lot of cases, we just don't know. They're a little bit unpredictable right now, but definitely there's a potential for some additional insect problems we're not used to seeing in corn related to cover crops.
All right, we have another question from David Reynolds. Are smart stack hybrids keeping up with pests? He says it seems a fair amount of producers are planting conventional hybrids.
Well, certainly the amount of conventional corn has increased over the last 4 or 5 years in response to the budget situations growers are facing. But that's kind of a separate issue from our smart stacks keeping up with pest issues. And I think on the BT above ground dimension, there's now been, established resistance of a number of the caterpillar species to the proteins found in smart stacks. Fortunately for us, those are all migratory and tend to arrive later in the season, so they're not a big threat for corn producers in Minnesota. Other than if we have late planted corn, for example. A little closer to home, Western bean cutworm has developed resistance to one of the cry proteins found up here. And in the maritime provinces, European corn borer out there has developed resistance to some of the BT traits as well. So, you know, it's a changing environment out there, and you know, whether we're talking rootworms or we're talking BT traits against caterpillars, we're seeing continued use and continued selection pressures leading to more cases of resistance.
Thank you, Ken. Next question is from Mohammed in Pakistan, actually, and he's asking basically why or what conditions can often lead to insects and rootworms attacking corn. So is it because of poor seed quality or due to environmental conditions?
With corn rootworm, it's probably neither of those. It's more a case of cropping practices. So in the United States, corn following corn is considered to be the cropping scenario that's at greatest risk. However, both northern and western corn rootworms have developed resistance to crop rotation. And so there is some threat to corn, even if it's rotated. And depending on where you live, it could be a northern corn rootworm issue or it could be a western corn rootworm issue. Seed quality is generally pretty good, so that's not an issue. And in-season condition of the crop is not as important for an insect feeding below ground.
Blake Carlson asks, is it possible that more chopping corn heads help populations of European corn borer versus pressure in the mid-90s?
Well, it's certainly not helping them any. You know, even in the older literature, there's some documentation that tillage can kind of help reduce corn borer by getting those overwintering larvae in a bad spot. But the thing to remember about European corn borer is that they're able to move between fields, and there's certain stages of corn that they prefer. And so what you do in one field maybe helps that field to a certain extent, but it's the surrounding fields that are an issue. And if we're looking at overwintering populations and where these corn borer populations build up, it's in areas where they've used, haven't had the BT above ground traits, and it's kind of a widespread practice in the area, and they've done it over a number of years, and that's where we see those populations coming back.
Thanks, Bruce. Anonymous asks, what % of growers use planter insecticide treatments?
That's a good question. I don't have any recent data on that. Bruce, what's your thinking?
Well, I don't really know. It's more of it, and we get a lot of questions on it, and some guys are trying to stick with dry, some guys are switching to liquids, but I think as we've seen the BT traits fail, and there was quite a few of those last year, Ken. The interest goes up, and you know, we're seeing even some research results now where we're getting an economic benefit for adding a layer of insecticide over the stack. So I think that's going to increase this year, and we'll see what happens with new traits and developments in corn hybrids down the road.
Anthony, I'd like to add a little more to what Bruce was saying on the layering issue. I certainly agree with what Bruce said. The challenge in all of this is knowing kind of what level of resistance you're facing in your fields. And if you're relying on yield data to tip you off, or if you're relying purely on lodging, you're behind the game. And by the time resistance issues become so noticeable there that you're starting to contemplate a soil insecticide or a switch in BT traits, at that point, the field's already producing so many beetles. For example, the reportable criteria in EPA for reporting a field failure to a company is half a node with some of the pyramids right now. And at that point, you're already producing over 250,000 beetles per acre. And those are beetles with resistance traits that are spreading through the community. So they may be ending up in your sowing, other fields you have and sowing your neighbors' fields with higher levels of resistance. The insecticides won't change that. They're an independent mortality factor, and I'd say most of the time in our trials, we only see about 60% reduction in populations with an insecticide. So the insecticides often by themselves are considered lodging insurance rather than, a kill approach to a population. You want the kill approach, rotate.
Yeah. And some of these fields are to the point that they don't really have any choice anymore. So, but it goes back to that earlier question on how do you know when you've got too much continuous corn, and the only way to do is scout and look. In the case of rootworms, look for beetles. Case of corn borer, things like corn borer or cutworms, do the scouting in season.
Thanks, Bruce and Ken. I'll add in just a little bit here that we're right at about 9 o'clock here, and we are, that's the end of our schedule at least, but we'll keep going, answering questions here. So if you do need to leave, feel free to do so. Just remember to fill out that survey at the end when you're prompted when you exit out. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next question. This is Bill Stengel again. In state surveys, do you target conventional fields for your European corn borer tunneling? Do you have any insight on northern corn rootworm overcoming RBT events relative to western? So 2 questions there.
On the corn borer, are you talking about surveys for corn borer?
It looks like it, yeah. So
yeah, and we've done that in the past, but part of that survey to maintain continuity, it's random fields as well, and you might suspect that if you're going to find a corn borer in that survey, it's going to be in a non-BT field. Ken, you want to address the corn rootworm part?
Sure. On corn rootworm, it's pretty common observation among ag professionals that are out looking at fields that we're seeing more northern corn rootworms out there, and that kind of reinforces what they've been seeing over a longer period in Wisconsin. In terms of the fields that have been reported to us where sticky traps are being monitored, for example, there are definitely fields that appear to have, elevated northern corn rootworm levels, which is very remarkable considering it was only 3 years ago that I had ag professionals coming up, or 4 years ago, that I had ag professionals coming up to me and asking, where are the northern corn rootworms? Because they were seeing hardly any out there. And so something has definitely changed in their favor. And you can have a discussion about, whether that's a result of starting to see BT resistance developing in the population, and that's why we're seeing more of them, or reducing competition from westerns is another, potential benefit of the colder winter we had, like in 2013 and 14. But whatever the reason, there's definitely more northerns out there, and we're seeing kind of a general uptick in populations of concern in terms of how many corn rootworm beetles are out in fields.
We have another question from Ryan Hagedorn. It says, I have been using capture in furrow corn rootworm on conventional corn. I am in a corn soybean rotation in all fields. Have you seen any performance issues with capture specifically? And are there any new in-furrow liquid insecticides that are better options for corn rootworm?
I'll take first stab at it. I know Bruce has some data that he might wish to share results from as well. But in our trials, when pressure builds, capture performance declines. And it's in some of the trial sites where we're deliberately going for high levels of population, we do see, performance issues with some of the less effective liquids. In terms of other products, right now, we're seeing good performance with Force Evo and with two newer products, Index and, got a mental block. With Index, let me take a quick look here. And Ampex. And I don't think Ampex is a full label yet. And I know that Index is a fairly hot product because it's an organophosphate pyrethroid blend. So there would be some handling, precautions that growers would need to take. But there are some liquid options that are looking fairly good out there that would give capture a run for its money or exceed its performance. Bruce, what have you been seeing?
No, I think I agree with that, Ken. And at Lamberton this year with some pretty horrific rootworm pressure, and I think it was partially due with when the rootworm egg hatch occurred versus corn planting and the summer weather. But none of the liquids looked very good this year. But even at that, they kind of followed that same order that you described with Index and Force Evo on top, and then declining from there.
Yeah, one of the other things, Todd, that I think everyone should consider is that when looking at performance and stability of that performance, the granular products tend to do the best. And then they overlap with the liquids, which are a little poorer in performance. And then that liquid spectrum, like Bruce and I have been talking, you have capture is on the less effective end of the liquids. And then you move into the seed treatments. And the seed treatments are the first to fall apart, even if you've got a 1250 rate out there. And a 500 in most cases only offers minor suppression, and a 250 really offers very little protection.
All right, for another question, this is from Rusty, and I think one or two others also asked about it in the chat. Can we use natural enemies to handle corn rootworm or other corn pests? Bruce or Ken, either you could take that one.
Well, on the corn rootworm side, I think that actually still is happening. In fact, before BT, when we had higher corn borer populations, we'd have kind of a cyclical nature to the outbreak. So we'd have a few years with low populations, they build up and then decline again. And one of the reasons for that is believed to be natural enemies, Bavaria, and that sort of thing. When we do our fall surveys for corn borer, we're also looking for parasitism, and that even with the lower corn borer populations that we have right now, that seems to still be working. So in the case of corn borer, they're still at least somewhat effective at suppressing populations. And then Ken, you might want to talk about nematodes in corn rootworm.
Yeah, so on the corn rootworm front, the single most vulnerable point for rootworms is just egg hatch to establishment. And there's a tremendous amount of mortality that occurs through that phase. Over the years, there's been a lot of incidental work done with various pathogens, Bovaria, for example, like Bruce mentioned, also, and
Nosema.
yeah, and there's also been work done with nematodes, and interestingly enough, the nematodes could be extremely effective in inundative rates. If you put out a huge bunch of them, you got good control. The trouble is the application timing was as the corn was approaching tasseling. So it was kind of impractical. However, Elson Shields at New York has looked at different species and the idea of an inoculative release, where you just put out enough to get them established in the population. And he's been able to show long-term effectiveness using nematodes. So I think there's some potential there. You know, are you going to get companies investing in something where they may only sell a product once every 4 or 5 years? That's a totally different question.
So there's a follow-up question that kind of is being led into here. Someone else also asked, do you get a chance to look at and research how well do you think biological treatments to control insects are going to be? So nematodes could kind of be included in that a little bit, but that tends to be more along the lines of some of these pathogens that are bacteria or fungi too. So is there anything more in kind of that realm going on that you're seeing?
So at least on the rootworm front, the challenge has always been that there's a lot of biological variables that drive whether or not these natural enemies are going to be effective. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Or is there enough rain to get things active and to maintain activity into the period in the life cycle when it needs to be there? And so you have trials demonstrating potential successes, and when other people would follow up on it in different locations under different weather conditions, et cetera, it turned out to be not very universally effective. And so that's been the challenge. I think the nematode thing on the inocular front is the thing I've seen lately that comes the closest. You've been hearing anything more on corn borer or some of the other LEPs, Bruce?
No, not really. There's no. I know there's some commercial Bavaria out there right now. And I mean it does kill rootworms, but I don't have any good data on how well that actually works in a field situation.
I know there's been some research that's been going on using things that modify insect behavior that would be more likely to bring the insect in contact with the pathogen, for example. But I think that's still at relatively early stages of development. So I don't know of anything that's widely proposed or widely effective.
I think you hit on this, Ken, and that anytime you're using a biological, whether it's for disease or insects or nematodes or even weeds to a certain extent, the big issue is that biological organism has its own set of environmental conditions and needs a certain amount of host to be effective. So they don't always overlap real well.
And I know when I was doing research with European corn borer, you get the opposite thing where we would try to do work with artificial infestations, but if the natural population wasn't doing well, our artificial infestations wouldn't do well either. Yeah. So there's some more macro environmental factors that are affecting performance of some of these things. And unfortunately for growers, they want to know they can rely on these products to perform when they really need it.
All right, so this goes back to the corn rootworm world. Harmon Wilkes asks about extended diapause. What's kind of the general state we're seeing with that lately?
Well, extended diapause is alive and well. We were sort of following its progression through the state. Think of it this way. You had an epicenter in southwest Minnesota, and there was also one kind of in south central Minnesota. And over time, those areas spread. And so you got, or to say a different way, ongoing selection pressure allowed the extended diapause phenomena to be observed in more locations. But as this kind of front was moving eastward, that's when BT rootworm traits came in. And suddenly we lost the ability to track how far those extended diapause traits had moved and were still moving. In Nebraska and in Iowa, they've in general detected more northern corn rootworm populations moving south, and they don't know to what extent that might be related to extended diapause. So yes, extended diapause is out there. We've got some phenomenal cases where we have BT resistant rootworm, northern corn rootworms that show the same level of resistance in the second year. So even if you threw a corn soybean rotation on top of, a resistant population, that corn year is still getting hit with the same level of resistance the corn population had.
That was actually another question that came up, Ken, was basically how widespread is BT resistance in northern corn rootworms?
Well, I would like to get the help of anybody listening to kind of explore that further. We know of isolated populations that are now higher than they've been in many years. We know we've got extended diapause fields out there where we haven't seen extended diapause in a while. Think of it this way, extended diapause virtually disappeared for about 10 to 15 years as a phenomenon people were observing, and now it's back. So if anybody wants to share their insights, I'm sure Bruce and I would welcome any comments they have. And if you've got a particular site that might be fruitful for research, let us know.
Ken, with respect to extended diapause and BT resistance and any type of change in behavior or resistance to pesticide, really it's hard to detect when populations are low. So it might extended diapause may be widespread and has always been widespread. We just don't see it because the populations are low, and the same with resistance. And I'm a little concerned as if we have another good year for rootworm populations this year. It's real possible that resistance is a lot more widespread and predominant than we think it might be.
It's a good point. I always used to use iceberg analogy, and essentially the size of the iceberg, the size of the population is going to determine how much we see out there.
I have one last question, and that will wrap us up here. And it's basically, someone was asking when they registered, insect pressure was horrible in 2020. What should I expect in 2021? That's a pretty open-ended question for both of you there.
Well, I think Ken kind of hit on it. Some of these populations or issues we're going to be able to track within a field from year to year, like corn rootworm, or in an area like corn borer. Some of the migrants, we have no idea. And the interesting thing that I'm kind of tracking is that when we had that cold snap, that went all the way down to South Texas. And I'm kind of curious what that did to some of our insects that overwinter down there, like armyworms, cutworms, even cereal aphids. So that may have changed the dynamic. So I guess I wouldn't feel too heartbroken if a lot of them froze down there, but we'll see what happens.
All right. Well, thank you both. And with that, I want to thank everyone again for attending this strategic farming Let's Talk Crops program. Again, there's going to be a short survey when you exit. It's 3 questions. And with that, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. Next week's session will be on soybean cyst nematode. And with that, I hope everyone has a great rest of the day and see you next week. Thank you.